let's go on with our next speaker, and that's Pam Underwood, who's the director of the Office of Spaceports for the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation. Known her for a number of years, as a huge supporter of what we're doing, and we'll love to hear her perspective this morning. Welcome, Pam.
Thank you, George. And I have to say, it is so nice to see people in 3 dimensions. It really, really is. I know we can only see like this much or this much, but just 3 dimensions people is nice. We see people on Zoom and Teams. I feel like I'm on them all day. But to see people in 3 dimensions, never reach out and shake your hand. I'm sorry for making it helpful. It's just nice to have that interaction face to face. It's really, really good. Secondly, welcome to Florida. So many people may not know I actually live here. I do not live in Washington, D.C. I think I have the best job in the office. I live about an hour from here. I hope you guys are enjoying our Florida winter. Want you to know though, heads up, you might need to bundle up tomorrow. We are having a cold front come through tonight. It may not make it into the 70s tomorrow. So for those of you that know the winters in other locations, enjoy it. It should be really nice. There's worse places to be than Florida in January, that's for sure. So anyway, thanks for the opportunity to GSA to come talk with you guys this morning. There's a number of things going on in Spaceports, and I'm happy to say that. You know, one of the things I like to leave people with, and I'll start with this, Spaceports is a vital part of our industry, but it is really less talked about. The things you hear about in mainstream media, even conversations, are the cool things that companies are doing, the cool payloads that are going up, the cool innovative launch vehicles that are coming out. And I don't want to take anything away from that, because that is cool. As a space geek for many years, that is cool. But the spaceports are really vital. That is where launch begins. It sounds corny, but it's 100% true. So these kinds of conversations, this kind of a group is where we need to carry that forward, because it will take a group such as GSA and others to get that messaging out there for things such as funding for infrastructure, other things like that. So I appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you guys today. What I'm going to talk about here is just a little bit of background about my office, in case many of you may not know, but we'll start there and talk about what's going on now and into the future. Next slide, or do I control it? Okay, so many of you may know, but maybe not. But my office was directed at Congress to establish in the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018. If you look it up, cut and paste here the most important part, but you look at the whole thing. It was given really 5 functions to go do. And as you can see, we're supporting licensing. We don't actually, in Office of Spaceport, issue the license. That still takes place in the licensing authorization division of my office, but we definitely support the activity. Develop policies, promote infrastructure, technical assistance. My office is really a policy shop and an advocacy area. That's really what we want to do, and that's where we look to go. So policies can also be important maybe when it comes to licensing. If you're proposing new activities that may not necessarily be clear in regulation, we can help with that. But it's really there to support the spaceports and the infrastructure associated with it. In fact, when I first read this, the infrastructure really came out and struck me in the face. It was obvious to me that those that advocated for this to be included were really keen, focused on infrastructure. And that's what I think is really the key takeaway from these functions. Interestingly enough, so this is part of the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018, pretty late in the year. I think it was passed in like November-ish or something. So we did stand up with the reorganization that my office completed in 2020. I became the first full-time director of this office, and we've been able to kind of get going from there. So still pretty new in as far as offices go, but we look forward to what to come. So what did I want to know? All organizations have a mission and vision. So of course, the mission of Office of Spaceports is to enable the safest, most efficient network of launch and re-entry spaceports in the world. That's really important, and we'll see later in the presentation, as George alluded to. This is a global industry. We have the best, the most infrastructure for space in any country. Now, we cannot take that for granted, but that's really important for us to highlight and continue to improve. And then our vision in Office of Spaceports is to advance a robust and innovative is key, because that's exactly what the industry we're supporting is doing. Innovative national systems of spaceports befitting the U.S. as a global leader in the commercial space transportation industry. So that's kind of what the organization has stood up to go accomplish based on the functions we were directed to in 2018. So here are the strategic goals for the office. We want to strengthen the competitiveness of our launch and range infrastructure and services. I already mentioned we've got great infrastructure. But infrastructure is funny. It's one of those things you have to continue to improve. Whether you're doing maintenance or innovating and advancing, it's not something you can do one and done. It is continual improvement. And that's what we want to focus on. We want to encourage, as I mentioned, innovation. I think that's important to keep pace with industry. And a key part of that first one is strategic partnerships. Because I think everyone knows with the infrastructure discussions that were going on within our government, everybody wants it, everybody wants to pay for it. So you need to have those key strategic partnerships to have the funding to keep the infrastructure going and where you need it to be in the future. I think that's a real key element of number one. We want to, the second one is modernize the regulation of the U.S. launch and reentry sites. And this is something I mentioned, George mentioned about too. We want to continue to promote increased public safety, but we want to make sure that we're doing it in a manner that supports the industry. Are there things, because our current regulations have been out there for many, many years, and they were envisioned of an industry that's clearly changed in the last 10 and 20 years. So what do we need to do in the future? Regulation takes time. Anybody who's gone through rulemaking knows that it takes time, and our 450 regulation came through pretty quickly. But we want to make sure that we look at it and meet with industry and organizations such as GSA to understand what are the needs as the FAA tries to figure out what that future state of regulation looks like. And then finally, we want to collaborate with other countries. It's a global industry, and I can't tell you the number of international folks that I talk with on a weekly basis that are developing spaceports that want to partner with the United States, whether it be as they develop regulations or capabilities, processes, safety practices. And so I think it's a real opportunity for our country, because we have the most infrastructure, the most experience of anybody, to really demonstrate and help the industry to get those kind of global standards that our industry currently enjoys in the United States. So that's why that's another strategic priority for our office. So here's some current focus areas. We work with the U.S. Space Force in the transition of the Eastern and Western Range. It's been called Range of the Future activities. We work real closely with our folks in the Space Force. And if I apologize right now for calling you Air Force, I'm sorry. It's going to take me a long time to get away from that. But we want to work with them because the transition of Eastern and Western Range, George said it best, a lot of our industry launches from Eastern and Western ranges. And what can we do as the FAA and industry to work with them to develop and understand what their plans are in the future? That's really important. The second one deals with infrastructure. So there's a lot of discussion about funding, and George mentioned it. There's a lot of discussion about funding for infrastructure. And the FAA, we can do some with letting people know in Congress and otherwise what the needs are, but advocacy for funding isn't something we do really well, and we shouldn't. But what we can do in my office, and I'm really passionate about this, I want to be ready so that the day that the money does come in, we can do something with it right away. And we can do something good. So my office this year, and we're going to continue into next year, we started a benchmarking effort. There's a number of other agencies within the Department of Transportation that issue grants. And others, just I stay within DOT for this year because it's in family with us. And we've been working benchmarking sessions, government to government. What do you have? What works? What doesn't work? So that we can revamp and have a plan ready to go so that when we do get money, we're ready. Because that's what I feel like my greatest responsibility is. Of course, I want to be here and understand the needs, but as Office of Spaceports, I'm ready to execute if and when we do get funding available. So that's a big focus area for us that will continue into the next year. We also want to coordinate the space transportation regulations with other countries. I mentioned that it's a growing global industry. Industry will benefit from a common global approach, whether we're talking about the regulation of spaceports or the regulation of the activities from a spaceport. Having a consistent set works really well. Since the United States government was the first country to have space laws on the books, we are very highly respected on the global community, and that's a really exciting thing. Countries come to us and say, well, what are yours? I can't tell you the number of workshops or technical interchange meetings I've had with other countries as they're trying to understand what we do. I've even had some countries take our regulations, cut and paste them, translate them into their language and publish, which is great for the industry. So I want to continue to do that as our industry grows. I think that's a benefit for us and for the global community. I already mentioned we want to modernize the regulation of launch and entry sites. We will look at that in the future. And of course, we want to, in the Office of Spaceports, promote the needs of nation spaceports. I think organizations such as GSA does a really good job of capturing what are the spaceports needs, what are the needs of the spaceports. Communicating that to Office of Spaceports is helpful because we do get requests for technical assistance from Congress. It's helpful for us to say, well, this is what we're being told by industry. Because it takes really the community all working together, a lot of time, like George described, the stakeholders working together, all the different levels to be able to accomplish things for the industry. So we look forward to working with you on that. I think everyone has seen this chart, but I'm happy to say we now have 13 FAA licensed spaceports. Spaceport Camden, I'm going to see how we saw him this morning. Steve Howard's probably happy. There he is. He's probably the happiest one out here. Around the country. We're really excited about that. But as I mentioned, this graph also shows the federal launch ranges and the exclusive use sites that are in operation. And you'll see in the next chart, which is a little bit of an eye chart, so when you're going to give five, I said like myself, if I don't see it, but that's okay. We'll talk through it. More infrastructure than any country in the United States, and that's what we need to do. We shouldn't rely on our legacy of the past. We should continue to look in the future. And all the spaceports are needed as a network to make sure that we can keep this industry going. Even the spaceports that are currently operating today, or don't currently have frequent activities, they're definitely needed as our industry grows, because we have a number of horizontal, vertical operations that are forthcoming that will be needing the entire network going forward. It's really exciting. And again, congratulations to Steve and Ken. So this is the eye chart. Unless you're really close, you probably won't be able to see it. But the reason I put this in here is because I like the perspective. So it's the global map, and it's the future and proposed spaceports. There is on our website, I will point this out, seeking additional information in the bottom corner, bottom right corner. Please go to that site. What I've done recently on our website is we've broken it down by region. It's a lot easier to read. We've had some interns do some research, so it's probably maybe a little bit more up to date than the global map. But really from a global perspective, that's what I'd like you guys to take away from this. From a global perspective, wow, that's a lot. But it's growing every day. And keep in mind, most of the launch re-entry sites are still in the United States. It's a very important thing to take away from this. But it shows that whatever we do planning forward as a group, whether it's GSA or partners within the government, we need to consider this global influence that we're having in our industry. What I'm finding is a lot of our industry launch providers are going to other countries to seek new markets. And that makes sense. It's the globalization of the industry. That's where you would expect it to go. So what could we do as spaceports to partner with up-and-coming spaceports, whether it's point-to-point transportation visions in the future, or just sharing of best practices so we can have some continuity for our industry. Those kinds of things are really important. So I think keeping an eye to the global community, that's something we do, like I said, on a weekly basis, and usually talking with somebody. That's very important to keep going forward. So it's really exciting for the organization at GSA to see that you have so much international participation. I think that's going to be really helpful for this group to keep that as in your line of sight as you go forward as a group. So I have to talk about spaceport infrastructure because that's what's hot on the month. I think I hear about that every week, maybe daily also. It's what everybody wants, like George said. Unfortunately, there's no dedicated funding. So I definitely hear you, and we hear you in the FAA. Grant funding is a priority for this industry. We heard you. Don't stop. The best advice I can give you, and I tell this to everybody, because you need to tell us, but you need to tell other people too, because we control the checkbook. So don't stop. I promise you, it might seem like you run into a brick wall, your message is getting through. Unfortunately, as a second bullet says, the third main bullet, the major 2021 bipartisan infrastructure bill did not have space names specifically. That's unfortunate. However, there might still be opportunities to use. I like to joke, George heard me say this before, if you don't have money of your own, you try to go find somebody else's to use. Not in a bad way or not in an inappropriate way, but there's definitely things that spaceports can benefit from infrastructure. Some ideas I had is ports. Many of your spaceports are on the water. There's a maritime administration that likes to, they issues grants for ports if you plan on bringing in some of your hardware on boats. That might be an opportunity. Railways, where's Mojave? If you have a little railway running right through Mojave, railways got money on the infrastructure support. Highway did. There's also clean energy options, potentially. If you look at it, George mentioned a little bit in your description about environmental and how difficult that can be. But what if some of our spaceports started doing innovative things that help the environment? That could be an opportunity for some of that environmental sustainability funding. So if we're creative, we can still benefit from this massive infrastructure investment that our country is doing, even though it wasn't directly named. So it's my hope in this calendar year to be able to put the spaceport directors in touch with the people that are handling those other types of grants. We did that last year with the maritime folks, the maritime administration. We believe all the spaceport directors were connected with the right folks in the region. But that same kind of idea is what we want to do, so that if there's an opportunity for the spaceport to benefit from some of this infrastructure funding, we can do that. It doesn't take away from space-specific infrastructure, which is what is on everybody's mind. And the DOT, the good news is, and George alluded to this, we have the authority to issue grants. It's just never been funded. So the authority is there. We're doing things to be ready for it. Let's see what we can do to be creative in the meantime until we get that. And I think the key is kind of that last main bullet here. Integrating multiple sources of grant funding. And what I mean by that is, maybe it's highways funding that you mix with something from the state that you mix from, commercial user. That I wouldn't call it commingling of fund, but not in an illegal way, in a very appropriate way. Some grant fundings allow that, and that's one of the things I've been learning in my grants benchmarking. I ask a question: if one of our spaceports got funding from you, could we use that as the match for maybe a spaceport grant? If we, those types of things, you can, as long as the money was allocated, the appropriation has to allow you to do that. So do your research on it. That's a good way to do it. Not all of them do that. Some grant programs allow commingling or using and matching the funds together, and that's what you should watch for. And that's what I would encourage if the industry is still advocating for funding for spaceports, encouraging that as part of the consideration appropriation for spaceports, because that enables us to be able to, intermix and use funding to the maximum extent possible. I think that's a really bright point into the future that hopefully we can take advantage of. One other thing I wanted to mention for you guys today while I have you, a really exciting thing that we're kicking off this calendar year is the security review. So this came out of, there's a FBI CASC, Civil Aviation Security Program, that did these security assessments for our nation's airports, and I think they do it on a decently ongoing basis. Some of you, Oscar, you might have been Midland before, and others that are to use airport spaceports. Well, somehow, and I can't really explain how, but I'm happy they did, we got on their radar in a good way. They would like to do a similar review at our nation's spaceports. Physical security, counterterrorism assessments, cybersecurity, those types of things at our nation's spaceports. They recognize spaceports are definitely up and coming. We definitely see the potential there and the benefit of working with our spaceports now to hopefully be ready for what they consider probably more large volume coming in the future. So I'm really excited about this. The FAA Office of Safety and Hazardous Materials is going to take the lead on it. We have some special agents working with the FBI as well as my office. We're going to kick this review off this year. We're going to start reviewing, hopefully 1 a quarter, maybe 2 a quarter if we're lucky, spaceports. It will be on-site reviews and we're going to assess those things I just mentioned. And the idea is getting a best practices for spaceport security document prepared. That's what the goal is, so that we can put this out there. The FAA doesn't have regulations. Please don't think that we're going to, we don't have regulations. You have to have a fence or a physical security around the perimeter, but it's not for the intention of what this is. Consider this a best practices document that will hopefully be a resource to our nation's spaceports, as well as maybe even global, depending on what the classification level is of the documents coming forward. But my goal, and what I've asked the FBI and the FAA folks that are leading special agents, is that we have a document that will be publicly available in the end. As we work through this, we promise, because we mentioned this to spaceport directors getting prepared, my goal is to make a document available to spaceport directors as a rolling basis. So if we go complete one review and then we complete another, we'll continue to update. So hopefully the ones that are at the front of the line towards the middle of the end get the benefit of what the first review has. I can't promise that document will be public, but we will definitely get information out there at the end of this about the best practices for safety. That's the goal. And depending on what we find, that might end up supplementing some of our future regulation of spaceports. It just depends. It's more information that we can bring in to help the spaceports and help the future of our community going forward. But I'm really excited about this one. Lots of agencies involved, and it's going to be a really exciting time. So look forward to hearing more of that into this calendar year. That's really the presentation I have for today. I'm happy to take questions. I don't want to run us over on time. This is Steve, James, George, tell me if we have any, but I'm happy to take the questions if you'd like.
Yeah.
Here's my contact information. If you want to ask something separate. Good to see you.
Hey, thanks, Director Underwood. Thank you for hosting us here in Florida. My question on the FBI review, if they do identify something, absolutely. Craig Smith, Oklahoma Air and Spaceport. Hey, thank you for being here, and thank you so much for your comments today. On the FBI review, as they identify potential, I guess, challenges or things that we need improvement on, is there a chance for funding?
Well, that's interesting. So I'm so glad you asked that question. I am not a security expert. I am a safety engineer nerd. We just start off by saying this. So I'm learning a lot from my colleagues that are the FBI's that are teaching me. So the individuals coming in to do the cybersecurity are with the Secret Service organization. Apparently for the U.S. government, that's who does it. That was news to me. But apparently, yes, there will be resources available. I don't know if it's actual money or just resources available. So let's say they come to Oklahoma and they find something, something that they recommend fixing. There are resources to help you with that. And that's the goal. I can't promise funding for everything, but I can tell you that there are a number of federal agencies stepping up to join this. TSAs included, Secret Service Organization, FBI, that will be helping out. And I think that's going to broaden an awareness that I'm really excited about. So definitely there'll be resources to help with, like percentage in cyber, because I've heard that before. But hopefully other things as well, Craig. I think that's a good question. Thanks.
So Pam, about a year ago, there was talk about the FAA working with Spaceports about having an interagency gathering to talk about Spaceports and things. Any updates on that? Is that a plan? And if so, when could we see some activity? And is there any way that groups like GSA can contribute to that?
Absolutely. Thanks for the question, George. And yes, that is absolutely still the plan. We were waiting a little bit of time to make sure all of our stakeholders that we want to have included in this government conversation had the bandwidth. And now I'm happy to report it looks like we do in this calendar year. So the plan is to get a government group of folks, stakeholders, my guess, and I'm kind of spitballing this a little bit, so I might be bear with me, but it'd be Spaceports, potentially DoD at the higher level, NASA definitely at the Space Center level, as well as the headquarters, ourselves, potentially Commerce, maybe even State Department if they're interested, Office of Space Affairs, to get them together to talk about a national strategy. What we're calling it, George, is a national spaceport strategy. We don't want to call it a policy, we want to call it a strategy. One that all of us can embrace is a strategy for us going forward. And it's in the way I like to think about it, it's kind of a kitchen sink approach, where it's going to include a little bit of everything. So, a lot of our regulations were written 20 years ago, or statute 20 years ago. Are some of the things in our statute still valid? Or how are we applying them? How are we interpreting them? When it comes to spaceport regulation, because I like to look at how we can revitalize or modernize our regulation. What do the stakeholders need from that? That's important. So it's getting a government conversation, the range of the future effort that I'm sure we're going to hear about more from our friends at Spaceports. That is part of it, but definitely not all of it, because whatever they end up deciding to do with the eastern and western ranges is definitely part of the Spaceport strategy. How do the commercial work with the federal ranges? Those types of things, competing with the private sector, all those things need to be discussed as a government. So it's my goal to get that started this year. And have the conversation. Now, as far as GSA or industry participating, yes, absolutely. Now, I will be honest, the vision is to have this be a government conversation. However, I know from years of working with the industry, we need to have the industry meetings. So while we may not have industry at every meeting, there's definitely a plan to have the industry participate either in one-on-ones or with a group or however, whatever makes sense for the topics that we need to discuss. Because yes, we can't do this in a vacuum, absolutely. And dates and things, please note to be coming. It's literally, we were talking about it just last week. So that's the plan for this year.
Good morning. Director Underwood, thank you. Francisco Partida from the Brownsville South Parallel International Airport, future spaceport, hopefully.
Yeah.
I'm sure your office is tired of hearing from us.
No, we're not, never. Come on.
You.
So my favorite topic is spaceports. You want to hear, it's fine.
Thank you. Tagging into what Dr. Neal said about having funding available, and us airports, at least on this side, we support Spaceports. That's why we're here. you won't hear a negative or a stop that, right? So in that topic, would AST support a letter to the FAA Office of Airports to allow that grant utilization since this infrastructure bill? And it all comes to the ADO, right? The Airports District Office Manager and what language they want to put into that grant.
Right.
So would your office be able to support us to kind of like tell the ADO, hey, you know, we have another office from the DOT and we want to achieve this? Would that be possible?
So I have to tell you, the Office of Airports and grant funding for airports is tough. It's tough. AIP funding is very, if you look at the language, it's very written specifically for aviation. And my brethren in the Office of Airports executes that to a T, which is great, that's their job. So remember I mentioned before in the chart when I talked about commingling of funds or combining funds might be a more appropriate commingling, there's not something that. But combining of funds, it's my goal to where if we get dedicated funding for spaceports, that be allowed to be combined with potentially grants within the Office of Airports. Does that make sense? Because if you look at our dual use airport spaceports, let's say you're going to come up with some infrastructure. A lot of times it might be used for both industries. It may not be exclusive to just space. You know, let's just say you're adding a taxiway or putting on that stuff. That's going to be used by both of your types of users. So it makes sense to me that you'd be able to do that. So that's my goal, to be able to make sure that we can mix those fundings together, but I think getting them to actually use it for a spaceport is going to be a harder challenge. And it's not because, again, my brethren are doing anything wrong. It's just the AIP, the Airport Infrastructure Improvement Grant Program, was written for very specific aviation uses. So to ask them to open it up to space is sometimes a little bit hard. But I would, like I said, it's my goal to make sure that we can try to get that mix of the two funding together, especially if you have specific uses for space-related items that you're saying too.
Thank you so much. And I have just one ask.
Yeah.
What Dr. Neal said about minimum impact spaceport concept. If your office would consider that, and I'd be happy to travel and be happy to make the calls, because we're in that process where we would love to have that little range of operations where we could go into.
Well, ask Steve Howard. I don't know where he went. Ask Steve Howard. I'm sure he would have liked to have that too. Because we definitely understand that the tall pole that's there. So when you look at regulation, whether it's called minimum impact or spaceport light or, you know, there's category A, whatever you want to call it, the idea is definitely there. And we would have to do that for rulemaking. And I do believe the plan for our rulemaking, because for those of you that are involved in ComStat too, I think our plan for rulemaking is still, we were going to do a rewrite of Part 440, which is financial responsibility, and then start up the spaceports. So I don't believe that the 420 would start this calendar year, but it's good to start getting those kinds of list of things together. And I would encourage GSA to provide that feedback to ComStat if for some reason you wanted to see that type of stuff sooner.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Hello, Robert Ayan from Ecuador Spaceport Project. Last year, the United States approved a $1.5 billion facility through the Development Finance Corporation, a U.S. institution, for infrastructure projects. And the opportunity that exists is that the U.S. government has a series of institutions that can provide funding around the world. So when we start thinking about having this international presence, I think there can be a great opportunity to have this type of package solutions where we go ahead and provide the standards. We have the list of American companies that sign the feasibility studies, because that's what other European organizations do. In this case, do other business, to do airports and roads. So I think that's a great way of thinking about how we can expand, and maybe in space will definitely a little bit of that situation. Because the funds are there. It's just about how we can make it a priority for space.
No, that's a great suggestion. I completely agree, because there's a number of international communities coming in. So we don't necessarily, right now, my office, when we engage, we have definitely things we've done this so many times now. We have certain topics we hit first, whether it's regulation or for certain things. So I think that's a great suggestion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate everyone's time today. You know, I don't want to bring it low over on time. So my contact information is up there. Just stop me in the hall. I'll be here for most of this morning anyway. Thanks so much for your time, guys.